Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Jurrien Timmer, Fidelity, with us now. Without question, the superb technical analysis on the street. I can't say enough about his LinkedIn effort required for global Wall Street. Jurrien, you're 93 weeks in and counting on this bull market. You got a nice compare and contrast to other bull markets. Why is this bull market different?
Well, where do I begin? And good morning, by the way. This has been an unusual market cycle because, of course, it came out of the pandemic, and the pandemic, 100-year storm has thrown all of our sort of market cycle tools sort of out the window, right? Because we had that massive liquidity impulse, and then the Fed had to, slam on the brakes. And in 2022, we had a 28% bear market without any drop in earnings. It was entirely valuation driven. And then, of course, the market bottomed. It certainly wasn't obvious in real time, but that first phase of the rally lasting, a year plus was really driven by just a handful of stocks. And the market has now broadened. This is now the second broadening phase that we've seen. The first one was from last fall, when you remember when the 10-year yield was on the brink of pushing through 5%, right. That caused a rate tantrum. And once the yield backed off, the market was able to broaden. The S&P equal-weighted index rallied as much as the cap-weighted index until this spring when we had another little rate tantrum. And now we have a second broadening. But by now, the Mag 7 or the Nifty 50, whatever you want to call them, are so big that whatever they do, the index does right with them. And that's a different sort of chapter in the book. And go ahead.
It's important. Jurrien starts talking and the market goes up.
Sure.
We just popped up 33 on futures. Paul, jump in here to calm the market down.
Jurrien, so talk to us about that rotation trade that we've seen over the last several weeks, as maybe the Mag 7, some money coming out of there, going into maybe small caps and some other sectors. How real is that? And is that long lasting?
It's a great question. And, I work with some of the smartest portfolio managers in the industry, dealing with asset allocation decisions. And it's been a torturous decision to make is, at what point do you lean against the leaders? And the world is your oyster, right? I mean, you have 493 sort of left behind stocks in the S&P. Then you have the Russell 2000. Then you have MSCI, all country world, EM. The menu is very large, but to get there, you need to bet against the winners. And if you're a few weeks early or a few weeks late, there's a lot of basis points that you leave on the table. So it's an ongoing question. To me, this one feels real, and I'll give you just a simple reason for that. For the first time in this cycle, the Fed truly is poised to cut, right? It's had a bias to ease, but now it has the green light to actually execute on that bias, starting in September. The question is how many times it goes, but it'll go probably at least several times down to maybe 4.5 or 4. That's my guess. That's where a neutral rate would be if the real rate is +1 and inflation is +3. And at the same time, we have earnings growth accelerating. Q2 season is underway, of course, and every Friday I go on my Bloomberg and I look at the expected earnings growth numbers, and they're +11 right now and rising. So if you think about it, and also let me throw one more stat at you, the S&P equal-weighted index has a PE ratio of 18, whereas the cap-weighted index has a PE of 24. So I put all those things together. You have a lowering cost of capital, a bond market that's well behaved right now, accelerating earnings, and reasonable valuations for most stocks, what's there not to like, right? So that if that's not a recipe for the market to broaden, then I don't know what there is. But then it's just a question of, can the S&P 500 cap-weighted index actually continue to go up as that rotation happens?
Talk to us about sectors that you like. What screens well for you and your team of portfolio managers outside of those handful of big tech names?
It's the cyclicals, it's the financials, anything that pays a nice dividend. And, again, if you're a bank, I mean, not the mega banks, which their cost of funding is, the deposit rate, which is about 0.5%. But the other banks, if the cost of capital is going to come down, they can sort of breathe again, right? I mean, it's like a weight is being lifted off the market. And of course, industrials, seems to me that no matter, who wins in November, we're going to get some combination of fiscal dominance and maybe industrial policy. And so the companies that kind of rebuild the economy, I would say, would stand to benefit.
In the Fidelity chart room of ages ago, folks, I've had such an honor to be in that chart room, and the tactile feel of paper and semi-log paper and pencil and, the pins in the paper and that. Jurrien, I know that's old news, but when you go into your managers, in particular large cap growth managers, good morning, Will Danoff, what do you advise them about portfolio concentration where their top 10 stocks are 50 or 55% of their portfolio? What do you tell those elite?
Well, it's a great question. And, the RPMs, at least the equity PMs, and I don't mean to speak for anyone, but of course we have a whole asset allocation group that manages the dominoes sort of at the top level. But I think for your typical portfolio managers, obviously they look at tracking error and they have to look at things like that. But I think the way they think of it is they want to own the best companies, and obviously you don't want to have
Jurrien,
too
just
much of them.
because of time, I've got to interrupt Jurrien because of time. This is critical. To me, it's a type 2 effect. It's not that they want to buy, say, Meta. It's they can't sell it. They sit there with all of their abilities, including fidelity, security, analysis, and they can't come up with a reason to get out. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you get out when the incremental fundamentals stop looking good, or the stock is too expensive, or it becomes too big. I mean, that can create risk management issues, and it's a careful balancing act. But yeah, you do need better stocks to replace them, right? Unless the valuation differential is so big.
Yeah. Jurrien, thank you so much. Jurrien Timmer, too short a visit. We're going to take you for a whole half hour. Next time, you're in New York. Jurrien Timmer with Fidelity. We own up the cards for politics, and when we do over 9.9, it's Henrietta Treyz.
Yep.
Henrietta, with Veda Partners, I should say. Henrietta, I was walking around yesterday, lost. I didn't know what to do with myself because it was the first Sunday since time began that I didn't have to talk to Henrietta Treyz about the world changing. Is calm returning to your political world?
I mean, finally, it's almost August. Everybody should be on Everybody is on vacation, and it's still whirlwind news cycle for weeks now. It's unbelievable. The way I term it to clients, and I think is pretty widely understood, is that this is a honeymoon period that's going into its second week for Kamala Harris. The Republican conference and Donald Trump don't have a good narrative to push back on her with yet.
Right.
The Democratic Party is just sort of running in happiness right now with Kamala Harris.
What is the strategy structure you see of a Trump campaign? If I have George Bush Sr. or name another Republican, I get in my mind that there's a hierarchy of advisors. Does President Trump have a hierarchy of advisors as he finds a new strategy?
Well, it's interesting because the hierarchy of advisors is not focusing on the things that a George Bush administration would. We should be talking about foreign policy, on tax policy. There's a $4.6 trillion tax bill that's going to be written next year, and none of that is anywhere. There are more trying to come up with a good tagline to define Kamala Harris. Even the immigration talking points aren't landing because so many of the reductions that have come in the last 6 to 7 months since February on the border in terms of deportation, in terms of the diplomacy that's happened with foreign nations at the Mexico border to keep migrants from entering the United States has dropped to levels that don't have the same tagline they did over the last 3 years. You know, the Biden-Kamala administration has gotten immigration at the southern border below the starting point of the Biden term. So I think a lot of their talking points on policy are not landing, and they're in offensive mode or defensive mode, on their pick of vice president, on Project 2025, et cetera.
Henrietta, you mentioned the vice presidential pick here. What's the latest on who it might be and when we might hear about a VP pick?
I think that Democrats are going to strategically try to draw this out as long as possible, as long as the palace intrigue is on who will she pick or who won't she pick. We're not talking about any of the policy prescriptions that Kamala Harris herself might have, her past support for different tax policies and things along those lines. As long as we're doing this palace intrigue stuff, it's a positive news cycle for the Democratic Party. So I expect that we won't hear the vice presidential ticket announced until next week. August 7th is when we should be finalized in determining that Kamala Harris will be the nominee. And so I think somewhere in early next week, that'll start to emerge. My money's on Mark Kelly, senator from Arizona. I think the plus 24-point boost that Harris has identified with Hispanic voters is what is responsible for opening up the electoral map to states like Nevada and Arizona. And then the plus 25 with Black voters opens up Georgia and North Carolina. So I would expect a more southerly focus than Shapiro in Pennsylvania.
How about the convention in Chicago? Should Tom and I be paying attention?
I think it's going to be a lot of pageantry, a lot of pomp and circumstance. I thought Trump had an excellent RNC and got a substantial boost from that. So if you like flags and balloons, by all means.
Henrietta, I want to go back to Mark Kelly in that the absolute salient point here of a major cultural issue is he's in Tucson. And so he's basically 100 and whatever miles from the Mexican border. He sticks out like a sore thumb for a huge body of Americans of all political persuasions about the southern border. How is he, as a vice president, and how is she, as a presidential candidate, going to spin that?
Well, I'm talking about Mark Kelly.
Yeah.
So you're asking?
He's in Tucson.
Yeah, I mean, he's in Tucson, and I think the willingness of Mark Kelly to buck against the Democratic Party for the last several years and his working relationship with the right is something that really stands out and is a stark departure from the Biden-Harris administration of the last 3 years, which is, obviously left-leaning, despite the fact that they have pretty substantial deportation numbers, larger even than Trump. And I think one of the big things we want to see him focus on is talking about the actual border itself. They need more border control. They need more boots on the ground, drones in the air, judges in the courts. They need all of those things in place. That's what the border security bill was about early in the year that the Senate passed. I would expect him to focus on that.
Okay, but the point I'm trying to make, folks, I think this is visceral. There's all this talk about the border. He's going to go, look, you go south on I-19 and you get to Nogales. I own that. Nobody else owns that. How do they spin that in Pennsylvania, Henrietta?
Well, I think that it's an issue for Pennsylvania voters, and he can demonstrate the fact that he's physically been there and he's the one that's actively trying to work with the border control, with customs, and have that conversation in Arizona that's telegraphed to Pennsylvania. A huge portion of the white male voter base in Pennsylvania and the white female voter base in Pennsylvania believes that immigration is the number one issue. Why not telegraph that right from the border?
Henrietta, what do we know about potential for debates, presidential debates going forward?
It's my opinion that they have to occur. So there's all this sort of back and forth drama about, what everybody's saying. It's unrealistic, in my opinion, I think optically and politically, for either candidate, either Trump or Harris, to decide that they're not going to hold a presidential debate. So I strongly suspect that one will occur, whether it's September 10th on ABC, which I think is what's currently planned, remains to be seen. But somewhere around that time, maybe even after Labor Day, into late September or early October makes a lot of sense. That's usually when you would see them occur. But I think one has to happen. So I think seeing Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump is something that all Americans are going to see at some point before the election.
What are the polling nuance do you focus on? I'm benumbed by it. I got like 18 polls. I got everybody. I got Nathan Hager, everybody else telling me what to do about polls. Henrietta Treyz, which of the polling distinctions are you focused on right now?
Well, right now it's all about waiting and seeing. We don't have any data from the swing states that's of value yet post-Biden dropping out. So a lot of the things I hear from Republican supporters and Trump supporters is saying, he's still ahead in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera. That's absolutely true, but it's also only true because we don't have any new data. What's happened with Kamala Harris in the last week is something that I've never seen in American history. Up 25 with black voters, up 24 with white voters, up 8 with female voters, up massive numbers with 18 to 29-year-olds, et cetera. The only area where she's declined is only by 2 points, and that's with voters over the age of 65. So this has been a spectacular rollout. I think there's a couple things to focus on. If you're concentrating on the Electoral College, monitor the Hispanic vote. We need to know what's going on in Arizona and Nevada and whether or not that Electoral College path really truly exists for Kamala Harris. We do not have that data yet. Really focus on those voters there. And then if you're, interested in political science and studying the trends, the gender gap in this electoral cycle is massive. A huge divide between men going for Trump and women going for Kamala Harris. I think that's fascinating.
All right, Henrietta, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Henrietta Treyz, managing partner at Veda Partners.
Folks, what we really try to do is talk to people of any given debate or conversation where, they take a different tact and all that. With MNNC Group, Grant Kamen, and also in New York, Ayesha Kiani joins us right now on Bitcoin. She's got a really wonderful track record here, working at Skadden Arps years ago and moving out through the Bitcoin maelstrom. Why is Bitcoin on the cusp of printing 70,000?
Because we had, a presidential nominee, Donald Trump, call us a high IQ individuals over the weekend. And he said, it's a marvel of a technology. So obviously, the industry rejoiced it, right? And it's not the first time as an industry we've been asking for regulations since 2017. The first time around, the debate around security versus utility tokens came up. But this is the first time a presidential candidate has put it on his agenda. And we've been hearing that Kamala Harris is also putting a team together on it.
Gensler caves in. We do ETFs. Paul's loaded the boat on this. He's got a 501k. But the bottom line is regulation to do what?
Regulation to recognize it as a separate asset class. The way Coinbase is a U.S. publicly traded company, give other exchanges like Deribit, Binance US a platform to, do regulated business, compliant business here in the US.
Paul, jump in here because I got like 14 questions.
Go on.
Why hasn't that happened? Why? And I guess you guys, you being the industry, are looking at it as some form of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Why hasn't it happened?
The reason it hasn't happened is because every now and then, even the funds that are trying to trade these assets, we get a consult from our, law firms that SEC could deem this as a security, right? So if any token that's not like, let's say, top 10% could get deemed as a security, we have to change our filings,
let me go back to basics here. If I bought this dog like Matt Miller at 50,000 and I unload it today at 69,000, do I report that to the IRS and do I pay a short or long-term capital gain?
It depends on when you bought it and depends on where you're buying it and depends on how long you're planning on holding the gain on it.
Okay, I get that, but you say it's a separate asset class is your desire.
That's
not
correct.
A bond, not a stock,
not a bond,
not under SEC, not a currency.
No.
Where is it on the Bloomberg? The yellow keys on Paul Sweeney's Bloomberg. Where do you want BitDog to be?
BitDog, I think let's keep Bitcoin as in Bitcoin, but we would want it to be just another ticker, right? Like ticker on NASDAQ, ticker on
so it's
stock
an equity.
exchange. Yeah. So, but under digital assets, right? Like we have
Okay,
Bitcoin
fine.
and we have Ethereum, just the way we have Ethereum ETF, Bitcoin ETF.
But Paul, are you going to pay taxes on it as a normal visible transaction?
Absolutely.
I think I am. How important was the spot Bitcoin ETF thing?
Look, from the volumes perspective, it has been slowly gaining momentum, right? But for us as an industry, it's about the overall recognition.
Okay.
Because it boils down to that, look, this asset class isn't going away. Give us a bit of guidelines, we'll move a bit more forward for you, right? Like we'll create compliant businesses, we'll run compliant funds, we'll create even more ecosystems on it, instead of this asset completely being moving offshore, which is, also being discussed by both administrations at this point.
Is that in fact? Is there a risk that the U.S. I'm not even sure if it has a leadership position in crypto. If it has a leadership position, is it at risk of losing it?
It does have a position in crypto because all the Bitcoins that have been seized over the years, and both Senator Cynthia Lumen, former President Trump have said, look, we'll continue building on this reserve and we'll hold it in the market instead of like selling it to the market. And this, we'll treasure it as one of like our national assets. And he went as far as saying that we'll bring mining, minting, all of the ecosystems, to US. Like if anyone has followed the space enough, years ago, it was China leading mining Bitcoin. And now it's kind of dispersed. So for a presidential candidate to come as far in his narrative, yes, that's...
You called an asset class, you want it to be equity-like, but a separate digital asset. We looked at a 10-year Microsoft piece today, 3.5% yield. You get a coupon, you get your money back in 2035. We're going to get tech earnings this week. Everybody's going to go mental about free cash flow and all that. Where's the underlying cash flows of Bitcoin, or is it basically a gold equivalent?
It's going to be a gold equivalent, but the main reason for us to push for legislation is like what happens when tokenized assets come into play, right? We're saying that, take any piece of an asset, tokenize it, give everyone a chance to own it. BlackRock has been very active on this, front. Like they built a fund called Biddle. They acquired, they invested in a company that could tokenize funds, tokenized, private equity markets, tokenized traditional assets. That's the long run we're looking for.
So there was a crypto conference down in Nashville?
Yes, Bitcoin.
Over the past couple days?
It started on Thursday, and Donald Trump spoke there on Saturday.
And what was, other than the former president speaking, what was kind of the theme? What was kind of the big issue?
Sure. So we have industry conferences that are, very much limited to different ecosystems. This was about Bitcoin. So this is the flagship Bitcoin conference that happens every year.
Is the bid on Bitcoin because of the ETF inflows? Is it just that simple? Retail showed up?
Exactly, yes and no, because the conversation has gone a lot more than Bitcoin ETF. Like, recently I had someone, a head of digital assets at a leading bank, basically tell us that, look, we're just waiting for clear guidelines on it, and then we'll just trade this like another asset, like another ticker. And I said, that actually makes a lot more sense for a small fund like us, right? Like for a desk like you that sees billions and trillions in volume. So it's not only us that's looking for guidelines, it's almost all trading desks.
Ayesha, thank you so much. Ayesha Kiani with us here at MNNC. Your daily look at the front page is the John Tucker Hour. He's been slaving away at this since 7:42 this morning.
I just compiled this in the last 30 seconds, actually. No. This is from the Washington Post, an interesting one about what went in to the selection of J.D. Vance, or who opposed it, actually. Until the very end, some people close to Donald Trump tried to talk the former president out of picking Senator Vance as his running mate aboard Trump's plane en route to Milwaukee for the convention. Senator Lindsey Graham argued that Marco Rubio would be better than the untested Vance because the Cuban-American senator might attract more votes in the battleground states. He tried to recruit others on Trump's plane to support his position. This, according to some of the people familiar with the discussions. Another advisor argued in a phone call just a couple of days earlier that Glenn Youngkin, the Virginia governor, or Rubio would be a better choice because of Vance's previous comments opposing abortion, asking Trump how he would defend some of the senator's positions that seemed to be a little farther to the right than his own.
Okay.
I had somebody sent me a note from 1972 when Tom Eagleton, for very different reasons, stepped aside. I don't know where this goes. I have yet to have a cogent statement from an expert like what happens given the first 10 days of Trump-Vance. I don't have any wisdom on it all. What do you got next?
This one is from the journal Go South, Young
Yes,
Graduate. Frustrating season for college graduates looking for entry-level jobs. Some smaller cities, especially in the South, stand up for their brisk hiring, good salaries, and the affordability. Raleigh, North Carolina, one of Paul's favorites. Austin, Texas. Baltimore, that's kind of surprising to me. Atlanta and Charlotte, North Carolina rank as the top 5 most promising locations to find work for newly minted college graduates.
What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's I think that's been the story for a long time. I just say, you think about the growth of the Sun Belt. That's been a story for 30 years plus, I think, in this country, maybe even more. But,
I'm ignorant on this. Is the research triangle, which was a fiction 40 years ago, is it maxed out, or
No.
is there lots of room for growth?
Tons of room for growth. And it's not just technology. It's also probably originally biotechnology was a big part of that whole thing.
Okay.
And you've got, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, NC State, and Duke all within 15 miles of each other.
Oh.
And you put it all together in the middle, and there you go.
And I did not know this. The unemployment rate for American workers between 20 and 24 is now higher than it was before the pandemic. This is all the research from ADP, by the way. The highest ranked cities for new college graduates tend to have the concentration of technology, health, and financial firms.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that all those cities you mentioned, they just seem like the cities we've heard about just in the last few years where people are leaving New York and coastal areas going down to the south.
I just saw
Go
a
south, young
chart
man.
that was, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. New York, California, Illinois, leading the exodus. There's some other states involved there as well. But I would suggest some areas, such as New York City, the tri-state area, are seeing a wonderful influx of immigrants picking up all sorts of jobs. Not the migration debate, but there is a depeopling of certain kinds of people, and some of it, Paul's, to lower tax states.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard that time and time again.
Do you perceive North Carolina as a lower tax state?
I do, absolutely. And Tom, everything relative to the tri-state New York City area is lower tax.
Right.
New Jersey has the
lower.
Unenviable distinction of having the highest property taxes
Oh, really?
in
You
the
mentioned
nation.
this before.
Hello,
Salt.
Somebody's got to explain to me who pays for all this stuff in Florida if there's no income tax in Texas. What are they taxing that makes up for income tax?
I haven't the foggiest idea.
Yeah, I'm going to ask.
I think we should go down and do some research. I'm thinking February.
Right. Yep.
All right,
Next, what do you got?
This is from the New York Times. Darren Mara should have stuck around for this one. As the rest of the world fought to keep inflation in check, one country welcomed it with open arms. In the past few years, Japan saw a burst of inflation spurred by pandemic supply chain snags and geopolitical shocks as a way to shake the economy out of its decades-long cycle of weak growth and pressure from deflation. So while the major central banks like the U.S. raised rates to rein in prices, Bank of Japan, of course, kept rates low as inflation accelerated. The theory was that by sticking with rock-bottom rates, the central bank could harness the temporary spike in prices to foster the kind of inflation it had long sought, moderate, steady, and supporting economic growth. Actually, it's a fascinating read in the New York Times for those of you who don't follow Japan.
Well, we didn't talk about Japan for 20, 25 years until Warren Buffett several years ago. Now it seems like every strategist says, hey, you got to be in Japan. I was like, where did that come from?
The yen, by the way, 153.81.
Yeah. John Tucker, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated.
Let's do because I did a movie review. I talked
boy.
to Alex Steele upstairs getting coffee.
Huge
Her
dead.
verdict is not the best one.
Really?
Walt Disney's Deadpool and Wolverine taking in $205 million in the U.S. and Canadian ticket sales this week.
The Telegraph in London was vicious. Vicious. I mean, they tore it. I don't know. I haven't
seen any of them, but Alex Steele is our resident Deadpool expert.
She is.
Yes. So, but it took in, like you said, 205 million domestic.
Million.
I think well over 400 million global. This is going to be $1 billion box office.
Right. Alex, thanks.
Huge.
We're up to 42 listeners this week. Do you know Alex Steele's listening to us?
Nice.
No, she was just getting coffee.
She wasn't listening to us.
She was listening to my question. I said, how was the movie?
It's great. You know, and she took the fam, and the popcorn was like $98.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
it's like going to Yankee Stadium.
It is.
Getting a hot dog and a beer.
Well said. Yeah. John Tucker, thank you so much for the newspaper. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.